Thank you very much for having me here. This is very preliminary, so thank you for coming. But I thought I'd take this opportunity since we had a cancellation to get people's feedback. So this is work joined with Anna Iser at Brown University, and Ryan Boone, who's a graduate student here in the Econ department, and Joan Vogel, who's an economics professor who couldn't be here today. Thank you for having me. So I'm going to talk today about labor market discrimination and disparities in labor market outcomes and schooling in the United States, and I'm going to concentrate on what happened during World War II. So if we look at the data from recent years, so in here we look since 1980 or since 1990, what we see is that both in terms of earnings and in terms of education, there is not a lot of evidence that racial gaps have been diminishing. So here you can see the trends for hourly earnings, and levels are moving for whites and blacks, but the gap or the ratio between these two numbers doesn't really show much of an improvement. And we can also see that for education gaps, there's kind of like a little bit of an improvement, maybe if we look at high school, but really overall, not a lot of improvement in recent years. But we can contrast this if we go back in time further, we can see that there were periods during which there was a lot more improvement. So in this figure, we see the average wage ratio, which people often look at. We can also look at gaps, but this is the figure we have right now. And this goes back to 1940, which is the first year for which we have earnings and wages in the United States that were collected at the population level. And so here you can see that the black-white male wage ratio increased here from about 0.43 to about 0.58, so like 35% increase during the 40s. Then it stagnates a bit, and then there's huge improvement afterwards in the 60s and 70s, and then you can kind of see that the changes since the 80s are really much more minor and not, in the right direction often. And if you look at high school graduation graph, and I'm going to explain why we're looking at high school later on, but you can also see that before 1940, things were either parallel or maybe diverging a little bit, and starting in 1940, you start seeing some significant convergence. And so the question is, what happened during, starting in 1940s, kind of what happened? So there's a lot of literature that has looked at what happens in the 60s, and it has to do with a lot of, social upheaval that happened during that period and a lot of associated changes there, but much less has been done on World War II, although some work has been done, so I'll tell you a little bit more about it. So, not surprisingly, what happened during World War II was, during the 40s was World War II, and there are going to be a bunch of changes occurring, but primarily there were, I want to say, two very large changes. So first of all, there were huge increases in government spending associated with World War II. That's going to be the focus on this paper, equivalent to about $3.1 trillion today. And there was what an economist would characterize that as large increases in the labor demand. So basically, these monies are being sent to different parts of the country in order to help work production, and the factories that are producing stuff that is needed for the war ramp up their production enormously, and as a result, they need many more workers for this. And these monies are often associated with training, and so our own faculty, Michela Bertelli, has a very nice paper working on looking at the effect of the training hand, so I'll come back to this later on. There's, at the same time, obviously a lot of men, or people, some women as well, pulled out of the labor market because they go serve, so there's a draft. About 16 million men served in the military during World War II in the United States. So you have a confluence of an increasing demand for workers, very large increase in demand for workers, and a very large decrease in the number of workers that are available to work. And interestingly enough, as a result of this, or maybe in combination, or in anticipation of this, there were some interesting anti-discrimination efforts that are less well known than the things that happened in the 60s. So there's really no major civil rights legislation during this period, but what there is an executive order from the president barring discrimination in the labor market related to employment in the war effort. Yes, ma'am.
Adriana, so part of the story about World War II is the influx of women to the labor force.
Yes.
How did that affect the labor supply?
So we're going to talk about that, but I mean,
Okay.
so essentially, there is a large decrease in the, let's call it, traditional labor force of the people who were employed at this time.
Right.
And what we're going to be arguing, at least, or we're going to be supplying some evidence on that, is that as a result, the employment of black men improved in many occupations. So that's kind of what we're going to go to, and that might be similar to the story you have in mind. And essentially, it's kind of what we're going to be finding here, that employers were forced to employ people they traditionally did not employ, and that had some long-term consequences. But what's interesting is that when we look at, maybe I'm getting ahead of myself, but when this paper is not going to really look at women, but we do have some results for women, and when we contrast what happened for women when we with white women in the labor force or black men in the labor force, what we see is that the effects for black men appear to persist, whereas by 1950 and 60s, the effects for women did not actually persist. I mean, there was a little bit of an increase, but it was much smaller than the temporary increase that happened during the war. So there's going to be something interesting there about why that's so. But I don't have much to say about that today. Yes?
To clarify, you mean white women?
Well, we can look at both white women and black women, but in our context, we tend to not find any, the effects that I'm documenting for black men, I don't see them for either black women or white women. Okay. So, in this paper, we're going to concentrate on looking at this war effort. So, what are we going to do? We're going to ask two questions. The first is, what is the effect of this massive World War II expenditures and associated production on the labor market of both black and white workers, and in particular man, as I said before? We're going to look at three outcomes: employment, occupation, and wages. And we're going to look at the very short run, medium run, and long run. So what happened during the war, what happened by 1950, what happened up until 1970, 1980. And then we're going to explore some mechanisms, like why would so we're going to find in here, similar to what other people have already documented, at least in terms of just documenting the trends, what we're going to find is that employment really did not improve that much, but occupation and wages changed. And that we are going to see that there's more black workers in semi-skilled or skilled occupations, and their wages have improved. And so we're going to try to investigate kind of what are the mechanisms for this. So one is a potential decrease in discrimination in the labor market. Maybe it's migration, like workers move to places where there's now employment, and so they get jobs that they didn't have before. Maybe there's a shift in industrial composition, so now we're producing stuff in some industries, and now they're producing even more stuff, and maybe those industries tended to already employ black workers. Similarly for occupation, maybe those occupations that are being promoted by the war effort tended to promote black workers. Well, I'm getting ahead of myself, but kind of what we're going to find is that these explanations are insufficient to explain the patterns that we see in the data. So we're going to tentatively conclude that the majority of the evidence is really consistent, most consistent with one explanation, which is that there's decreasing discrimination. This is obviously traditionally really, really difficult to show. So it's going to be suggestive, the evidence that I have for that. We're going to also keep track of what else is happening with the war. So obviously, it's a war. There's massive stuff going on, not just the expenditures, but people are going to war. So we're going to look at mobilization, which of course affected labor supply, and we're going to find that mobilization itself cannot really explain our pattern. So just to be clear, we're not saying that mobilization, the fact that a lot of men were taken out of labor force, didn't have impact in many outcomes. They're just not going to explain the effects of the expenditures themselves, okay? And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. And then the second question that we're going to be interested in this paper and looking at is what happened to the next generation. And so we take a big shock in the 1940s, and we see that this improves the relative outcomes in the labor market for blacks. What happened to their children? And so we're going to look directly at what happened to enrollment, years of schooling, or work of 16 to 18-year-olds. And the reason we're concentrating on these ages is because, you know, if you look at the 1940 census, like almost everybody at age 15 is enrolled in school. So really is age 16, 17, 18 where you see a large drop-off of individuals that are choosing to not go on with their schooling. And so that's kind of, in this time period, this is the margin where people are dropping out. And so we're going to look to see whether the war efforts affected their enrollment decision. And we're going to find some effects. And then we're going to ask, why do we think that these monies affected the enrollment of the children? And we're going to consider kind of three mechanisms. And one is that the parents, I just demonstrated or will have demonstrated, the parents have greater incomes, and that's what people do when they have more money. They spend it on their children, their health, and their education. So that's one possibility. Another possibility is the children see that now, well, you know, it pays off to have some education because they can go into skilled or semi-skilled jobs. So they have an expectation that now it pays off to do this. And another possibility is that the relative standing of blacks in the community improved. They could have used their earnings to move to neighborhoods with better schools, or to argue for more spending in their own schools, or do things that would help their children stay in school anyway. So that's more of a political economy or kind of political power kind of explanation. And so we're gonna look at this, and we're gonna find at the end of the day that family income is the most plausible explanation. You know, all these other things could have been going on, but we don't find much evidence that they were going on. So I'm sure you're going to ask me the question I always get asked, and so I'm just going to answer it now. Why do we care about what happened in World War II? And like, we're not going to have another war, and so what's the implication for like, or do we need a war in order to improve the outcomes of the less well-off in society? What am I saying? And so I think that what we're going to be saying about why this is relevant is because there are great differences in family income today. And there are a lot of people who are talking about how to improve outcomes of children by, for instance, improving schools or doing other things. And we're kind of saying there's a simpler message at the end of the day, that if families had more incomes, they would take care of their children. And so that would be one message to carry out with. Not to say that these other things aren't important, but that the trends in family income maybe are an important contributor to today. Yes?
I'm sorry, I just have another background question.
Yes.
So what happened to black men in terms of volunteering and going into the military or the draft?
Yes.
That's number one. And then for black men who went into the service, presumably they had access to the GI Bill after the war, right?
Yes.
And so you think another hypothesis might be that they used the GI Bill, more black men became educated after the war, and that might affect their kids.
Yes, so that's where concentrating on this population is really helpful, because that population is not benefiting from the GI Bill itself.
No, I mean the father may have benefited.
Oh, the father, okay.
And therefore his child may.
So that might be,
There's a lot of
We-
evidence that black men were discriminated in the GI Bill.
Oh,
like they were
yeah, I'm sure.
discharged, they were denied services.
I just don't know enough
schools weren't
about it.
allowing them in, so I think it probably more accurately reflected what was already happening.
let me, what evidence do I have right now is like, what I do know, we should look more into that. So, but what I do know about my results is that when we look at the effect of expenditures on the wages of black workers in the 50s and 60s, that the effects that we find cannot be explained by changes in schooling. So we do look to see whether this is somehow rationalized by that. And so something I haven't told you, but I might as well say right now, which is that mobilization rates are negatively correlated with expenditure rates. So places that got money to produce stuff were places where people were not drafted. And that's for the same reason, because there was a policy that basically there were industries that were key to the war effort. We're going to protect, we're going to send them money so they can ramp up production, and we're not going to like take people away from them. And so that already kind of shows you, so again, it's not to say that the GI Bill may or may not have had effects on people's education and differentially so by race. It's more to say that it doesn't really explain our findings about the effect of the war expenditures themselves and on the effect of the war expenditures themselves on the next generation. So I don't want to dismiss that there are other things that are happening. I just want to point out this particular kind of explanation, if that makes sense. Okay. What we're going to do is simply take data on World War II expenditures across metropolitan areas, so most of the monies went to cities, and we're going to look at how that affected the levels and the relative standing of blacks and white workers, and look in their employment, their wages, and how many of them are semi-skilled occupation. And we're going to essentially compare the trends in places with more and less spending. So the intuition is going to be simple. Some places got a lot of money, some places didn't. Immediately you're going to say, but weren't they already different? And isn't it maybe the case that places that got a lot of money were places where blacks were already improving? And the answer is going to be no, but I'm going to show that to you. And that's essentially the requirement for identification here, is that whatever changes we see from 1940 to 50 to 60 or whatever, were not trends that were already in place or occurring, so that we have a sense that there was really a change occurring with the war and not something that was kind of an ongoing improvement. Okay, so we'll come back to that. And then I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but we do have an economic model that kind of tries to put all of this together, and essentially has a model where people choose where to work and where to live and which occupation and industry to work in. And we use this model to make additional predictions to separate between different explanations. So if we have time, I'll talk a little bit about this, but not too much about this. But this model is also going to allow us to kind of quantitatively say something about the different mechanisms by which the total effects are operating. So I kind of already told you everything that I want to say about what I found, except so we see improvements in the share of blacks in semi-skilled occupations, in their wages, and both absolute and relative levels. We find discrimination seems to best explain the patterns. The draft doesn't explain the patterns as much, and when we look at the education of the next generation, we find some very specific patterns, and we're still kind of struggling to explain them, but basically what we find is that black boys in families with a father, they saw their education increase if they were living in areas that got greater World War II expenditures. Girls or children in families without a father present did not. And this is part of the reason why we think it's family income, because most of the people who were directly affected by this war effort, going back to the issue about men versus women, were men. This is the man. And so if you're in a family without a man, we don't see effect on their children. And this is why we also think that it has nothing to do with political economy or them being able to get better schools, because we don't see benefits to children that weren't directly in families that were affected by the war, or potentially affected by the war effort. So I'll show you some of these results later. Okay, so I'm going. So there is, of course, a lot that has already been written on this. So there is a bunch of work on black workers during World War II. It's known that there was occupational upgrading during this time period. It's just in the data. You'll see it. I'll show you this later. There's some work showing that some of that upgrading was associated with greater deaths in World War II. So in particular in the South, if a lot of white men died who were in particularly skilled occupations, then blacks were more likely to enter those occupations, and that's very consistent with our story. There's some work by Collins that shows that the executive order prohibiting discrimination seemed to have been effective in increasing the share of blacks in some more skilled occupations. And then there's some more descriptive evidence showing that basically the post-war world in the United States is one in which there is known as the Great Compression period. So basically there's huge income inequality by the end of the 1930s, and by 1950s, inequality has fallen quite dramatically in the United States, and so people have hypothesized that somehow blacks benefited from this Great Compression, although that literature doesn't really quite tell you why. And then there's a bunch of migration going on. So migration was very low during the 1930s and the Great Depression, and it picked up in the 1940s and after the war quite substantially. And so that definitely contributed to the improvements in the relative standing of black workers. But it's really not, as I'm going to say, it's not really going to explain the findings that we have. And so we're going to show that World War II is kind of the main source of upgrading that's going on and of increases in wages. And we're going to push at least that the most reasonable interpretation of the data is decreases in discrimination associated with this. There is also a literature thinking about what's happening to black children during this time period. So the schooling quality of children, black children, that is low, particularly in the South, but it is improving. And so that has something to do with the improvement for them during this time period. And you mentioned that there's the GI Bill, and so that also has some effect on them. What we're going to have to say relative to that is that we think that income actually, just pure income, actually has something to do with the improvement in their education. There's another literature in economics that really talks about talent misallocation or the effect of discrimination in the labor force, and kind of that literature shows kind of indirectly that there's been substantial changes in the allocation of gender and race across occupations over time. And what that literature tries to do is quantify how big is the loss from having talented people who are not allowed into the occupations they're capable of having, and finds a relatively large effect of discrimination, but also finds that, I mean, they don't call it discrimination, they call it misallocation, but also finds that misallocation has decreased quite substantially. So in some sense what we're saying is that there was, we can use the same model and kind of explain using this exogenous variation or close to exogenous variation that there was a decrease in misallocation as a result of the war, and kind of quantify how much of it happened. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about World War II. So you may or may not know, I already said it was gigantic. It is the largest expenditure that occurred in U.S. history. So if you plot the ratio of expenditures to GDP, World War II was the largest, is the time in which that number has been the highest. It reached something like 40% of GDP during the 40s, and it has never been as high, although it's trending that way these days. And just also for reference, you know, there's a lot of work, including my own, talk about New Deal spending, and New Deal spending was big, but it was much smaller by comparison, again, to what happened in World War II. Most of the money went to military supply contracts, and some of it, 15%, went to like improving buildings and construction of new facilities. So this was mainly ramping up production rather than creating new factories or buildings or anything else. And as I mentioned, there's this executive order, 8802, requiring non-discrimination in employment in the war defense contracts and requiring training of many of these firms. So what do we already know about the effects of these expenditures? So people have looked at this before, and it's kind of interesting what they find. So something that's relevant for us is how did they decide where to spend the money? And for instance, was the racial composition of the population something that was an important consideration? And the people who looked at that suggests that the allocation of spending was mostly based on where was manufacturing concentrated, and it was not based on political considerations, or at least retrospectively, there's no correlation between the political composition of Congress or other factors and where the money went. And I'll show you some evidence for that. Okay, so the money went to where the factories were, okay? And then what happened afterwards in those regions, to the extent that people looked at that, what they find is that regions that received a lot of money got more people to live there, but they didn't subsequently grow faster or more than other regions. So the relative local economic improvement didn't happen. So you might have thought, oh great, we sent all this money and we expand manufacturing, these regions are going to take off and they're just going to be better forever, and maybe that's what's going on. Everybody's getting richer, not just some subgroups, but everybody. That does not really seem to be the case, and people have looked at this both nationwide or in the South. So really, that's kind of the context of what we know. Let me tell you a little bit more about the executive order, and it just said that that there shall be no discrimination in employment of workers in defense industries or government because race, creed, color, or national origin. Interesting, it doesn't say gender. So, but we'll come back to this. There's really going to be a difficulty in our setting about is this really less discrimination, or is this in some sense desperation that they have nobody else to hire? And I'm going to argue, yes, it's desperation, but it turns into lower discrimination later on. So the story that I'm going to tell you is something like, in the short run, they don't have people, they don't want to hire people they don't typically hire, but they're forced to hire these people, and for some reason they keep them later on, which means that somehow the experience of having these workers changes the employers or employees' perceptions, because what we're going to find is some kind of long-term effects of these. So the way that this worked was that all the companies that got monies had to uphold this legislation, and there was a committee, the Committee on Fair Employment Practices, that would hear complaints. And so the paper by Collins is a paper that correlates and says, look, the share of black workers employed in defense industries went up in places where there were more anti-discrimination cases. So he has some measure of how many cases were brought to this committee, and he shows that this is kind of predictive of the improvement, the relative shares of employment. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to have data. The data is the data on expenditures on the war supply contracts by county. Some of it is already available online, some of it we have digitized. And then from census data we have employment outcomes. But we also went ahead and digitized employment during the war period from the war reports, from the war boards. And so there was an employment agency created during the war that was supposed to help the war effort and was supposed to create reports on how many people were employed and where were places where there were shortages. So we digitized the data on employment and we digitized the data on shortages to track exactly what happened during the war. We also have enlistment data, so those are available also to everyone. And we have maybe some additional information that we're going. Rather than using the actual enlistment, we're also going to prefer to use the predicted enlistment rates, because in some places people were supposed to serve but didn't, and why didn't they? And so we worry that maybe they didn't because of other reasons. We don't want to have to worry about that, but we know the rules by which people were supposed to be drafted. And so they were supposed to be drafted based on their gender and their age and their marital status and the occupation that they worked on. So again, some things manufacturing, but other things like farming had special status, and people working on these industries could be given deferments or not serve at all. So we know these rules, and so we can kind of compute how many people should have served in each of the locations we look at. And we have the labor shortage data from the commission as well. So the labor market outcomes comes from all the census, and we're digitizing some of the 1950 data because the data online that's already available is only for 1% sample of the population. That's going to be an issue for us because that's going to give us small samples in some locations. And then for the education of the next generation, we're going to look at school enrollment and educational attainment. And then we have a bunch of other data I'll tell you about when we get there. So this is a map of expenditures, so you can kind of see two patterns, which is that, you know, this area, the Northeast, where most of the industries are concentrated, a lot of employment went in there, a lot of money went here, very little money in relative terms went to the broader South of the United States in comparison. So this is kind of the distribution. We're not going to be looking at this map exactly. We're going to be concentrating on cities in this map. But the cities account for, I don't know how much of the population, the cities that we look at account for about 50% of the total population, and they're mostly where the money went to. So there's something else to say. I mean, again, in this map, if you look at it, there's a lot of yellow, which means you got no money at all. And that's kind of what this figure shows, that the distribution of expenditures is very skewed. A lot of places, more than 50% got zero, and then some places got very, very large amounts. And again, that's mostly based on the existing industrial composition. So here's some regressions showing that. So we have 137 cities. We can do this again at the county level or at the state level, and it's pretty similar. The dependent variable here is the war expenditures per capita, and here we regress that on everything that we can observe. And then alternatively, we can look at months of labor shortages during the war. So in the first column, what we see is that manufacturing is the only statistically significant thing, except for the draft. And so the money went to the places where they were manufacturing, and the immigrant or racial composition of these places did not have a statistical significant effect, nor did the composition of like the share of jobs that were skilled, or how much money the government was already spending there, or anything else. So there's two things that are predicted: manufacturing and the predicted draft. And so I already mentioned that the predicted draft is negative in places that got money. People did not serve. So we can do this with the predicted draft or the actual draft. But that's kind of because in the formula, it's already built in that the places that have manufacturing defense contracts are not going to be drafting as many people. And another interesting thing to see is that war expenditures per capita are going to be strongly predictive of how many labor shortages there are during the war, according to the War Commission. And most interestingly there, in suggesting that there was existing discrimination against workers, labor shortages were higher in places that actually have more immigrants or more black workers. So this suggests that these are places that they were somewhat reticent to hire this particular labor force during the war. Okay, so that's kind of what we know. Now let me tell you what we see is the effect of these expenditures on the labor market outcomes of men. And I'm going to separate that by black and white. So the first thing that I'm going to do, though, is kind of document for you stuff that's kind of already known, but just so that kind of you see the broader picture on the importance of really what's going on during the war is the changes in where people are working. So if you step back and you looked at 1940 and you looked at where are blacks and whites working and what are the main sources of the wage gaps, what you would see is kind of interesting is that you might have thought that there was a lot of discrimination within a job, in the sense of within a job, black workers are paid less than white workers. But in the data, what you see is that that's actually not very important relative to the fact that black workers are mostly just in unskilled occupations, whereas white workers are in skilled occupations. And so what really happens during this time period is that the share of black workers that start working in semi-skilled or skilled occupation improves dramatically. And so that's fact number one. And you can see that, you know, the share of white workers also goes up, but that kind of follows a kind of a pre-existing trend, whereas for blacks, there's more of a break starting in 1940. So they were slightly slinching up, and then they kind of more strongly start converging upwards. So that's fact number one. Fact number two is that there's a very strong correlation between a greater share of people working in skilled, semi-skilled occupation and their wages going up. And so in here you can kind of see in places where more blacks access semi-skilled jobs, their wages went up by more. So now, of course, somebody would say, yes, but there are all these other changes happening with their GI Bill, there's changes in education, how do we know it's all this? And so we can do kind of a standard exercise in labor economics which tries to decompose the sources of these changes into what happened, how much of the wage gaps that we observe are due to observable characteristics and how much they differ across groups versus unobservable characteristics. And so if we do this exercise, we get this table over here, and this table kind of says, okay, let's take a look in 1940. There's an overall gap in log wages of 0.6. When we look at what is the source of that gap, then we look to see what is the biggest number in this column, and the biggest number in this column is occupation. Meaning the biggest differences in the gap come from the fact that the distribution of occupation is very different across the races. And that is the biggest. The second most important contributor is education, but you can see that age, geography, industry, fraction living in urban areas, all of those have very small contributions otherwise, and of course there's a lot of stuff that we don't know about. And then if you look at what happens by 1950 or 1960, then what you'll see is that this gap in wages fell. Okay, notice that it didn't really fall that much between 1950 and 1960, really between 40 and 50. And then when you look to see in 1950, what are the biggest differences again, there's two numbers that stand out, occupation and education. But the contribution of occupation fell the most, fell a lot, and so did the contribution of education. So changes in occupation and also changes in education are the most important contributors. Sadly, a lot of the contribution of education has to do with the fact that the returns to school actually went down for everybody. And so education matters less not because blacks are having more education relative to whites, but because everybody with an education is earning less as a result of their education. So at the end of the day, if we put this explanation aside, occupational grading seems to be where the most of the action is going up. So that's just descriptive. Now let me show you how does that relate to the war efforts and the draft. So what we're going to do is run a regression where we look at what happened during the war first. So very short term, we're going to look at the share of individuals working in defense between 1940 and 1944 as a function of war expenditures. And we're going to look at this by race. So how many people are working in the defense industry, and how did that change during this time period? So the question is going to be, in places that got more money, did people work more in defense industries? So that's going to be this coefficient here, beta 1. And then we're going to ask, is that different? Is that beta 1 different for blacks and for whites? So that's going to be the exercise. And our main interest is the variable of interest is the total war expenditures per capita. And we can or not control for a bunch of things to see if they matter a lot. So unfortunately, the reports during the war do not separately report men and women. So these just bunching everybody together, there's nothing we can do about that. But here's the coefficient on spending times post. Also, this is not changed, right? It's still up, I guess. Okay, anyway, I'll come back to that. So this is kind of showing that that the share employed in war industries increased more in places with war spending relative to non-war spending. And that is affected somewhat when we add baseline controls. permanently, obviously, because we're including manufacturing. It's not particularly affected by controlling for the draft rate or the predicted draft rate. So I'm only showing the predicted, but the results are really very similar if we use the actual draft rate. So these are the numbers for blacks and whites. And so in here, what we can see is that both blacks and whites went to work in war industries. Okay, so that's all that you can say about that. Oh, it's the change. Okay, sorry. Oh, it's the change. Okay, sorry. Okay, so during the war, there was an increase in employment in the war industry, and that's true for both black and for whites in this period. So, okay, so what happened afterwards? Because that's going to be the interesting thing for us. What happened 1940 to 1950? And then we're going to look beyond 1950. So first I'm going to show you some graphs, then I'm going to show you some regressions, and then I'm going to show you like the very long-term effects. So during the war, more people worked in wine industry, including white men. But now what happened by 1950? What happened by 1950 is this. So if we look at black men, this is the change in the fraction that is employed at all. So this is just employment, okay? And here what we're going to look at is we're looking at the change 40 to 50 in the blue dots, and the change 30 to 40 in the black dots. So what this is saying is, look at the places that have more war expenditures. And where they're employing more people in the 1930s, and the answer is a little bit more. And then if we look from 40 to 50, then a little bit more, really, but it's the same trend. So really, for employment, you know, there's a trend. In some places, there's greater employment 30 to 40, and that continues on 40 to 50. Nothing happens. Nothing is different between these two lines in terms of the slopes. So there's not going to be any change in employment, really, associated with the war expenditures that's different from what was already happening before in 1930s, in 1930 to 40. And the same is true for white men. So overall, you know, whatever was happening in these areas differently from these areas in 1940, 1930, that continues on. So these lines are not, they don't have different slopes. Now contrast this with what happened to the fraction of people working in semi-skilled jobs. So here you can see what was happening 30 to 40 was that in places that had a lot of war expenditures, the share of people working in semi-skilled jobs was falling. And that reverted to increasing 40 to 50. And it reverted 1940 to 50. Now, it's true for black men, it is not true for white men. So for white men, you know, whatever was happening in 30 to 40, that same thing continues happening 40 to 50. So really, this kind of illustrates, yes, both black men and white men went to war in this, went to work in defense industries during the war. After the war ended, you know, the share of people who are employed in these locations isn't really very different, and the trend in employment isn't really changing very much, not for blacks, not for whites. But what is different is that blacks are now much more likely to be in semi-skilled jobs than before, and that's not true for whites. And then if we look at wages, we kind of see that in places that spent a lot of money, there was a greater increase in wages for blacks relative to places without spending. The same is true for whites, so the wages of white men also increased as a result. You can kind of see these figures are drawn in the same scale. You can kind of see that the increase is larger for black men than it is for white men. Yes, ma'am?
Can you also look at employment on the intensive margin? Like it's possible that they were increasing their hours worked, and this could be contributing to their wage income?
We can do that, and I'm not sure if we have. I think the hours, there's always an issue that hours are dismally measured in these surveys, and they're not greatly measured in 1940, but we can definitely take a look at that. We can definitely look at that. So if we do this in a regression, we're going to regress the outcome of interest on the war expenditure interacted with a post dummy, and then we're going to have fixed effects for the region and possibly controls. And we're just going to look at this coefficient over here. So again, the identification assumption, which I've tried to provide some evidence for already in these figures, is that that places that got the money were not already places where blacks were doing better. Yes, ma'am?
I may have misunderstood, but a couple of graphs back, were you showing the share of blacks in semi-skilled jobs were actually declining in kind of the prior periods, so just 30s to 40s? Do you know why that was happening? And or is there any kind of concern that there was this pre-trend and then there's some kind of like reversion to the mean afterwards in the 40s, 50s?
I don't know because, you know, this is pretty flat for whites. The whites make up like 90 or more % of the labor force. And so it's hard to argue these were areas that were in decline more generally because, you know, there's just really nothing happening for whites. Now, the data, we can do this. We also have, I'll show you this in the paper, we also do this 20 to 30 to go a little back further, and it's the same thing. Now, sadly, we cannot do that for wages because wages only started in 1940. So we can go back to 20. I think we can even go back to 10 or something like that. Because your concern is that there's kind of like a reversion to the mean. And I don't think that's what we find. Let me show you later.
What explains the decline?
Sorry?
What explains the decline?
Well, I don't know if this decline is statistically significant or just a couple of points over here. I mean, what we know from estimating this regression is that this line is very different from this line. Now, is this slope statistically significant? I don't remember.
Once you do the regression at like region trends, it
Yeah.
disappears.
Yeah. So let me show you more about this, but we'll work on. We'll think about this. You know, I don't know whether this is a statistically significantly negative slope over here. All I know is that these two slopes are statistically significantly different from each other. Of sorts. I'll check on that. It's a good concern. So let us check on that. Yes. Sorry. Go ahead.
Can you explain how do you categorize occupations into semi-skilled?
Oh, how do we categorize occupation into semi-skilled and skilled? There's some standards. So there have been a lot of previous work on this. I think we're following kind of the standard way of doing it. You just take a look at each occupation and then they're kind of categorized into no skill, semi-skilled, or skilled occupation. So I can probably show you a list of the things that qualify on this. Most of what we see, to be clear, is in the semi-skilled shares, not the very skilled shares. So the skilled category would include professional occupations like lawyers, doctors, blah, blah, like the very highly paid. Most of what we see, so if we look at the detailed occupations, what you'll see is that you have people who are now, let's say, the managers in the factory floor or something like that. So that would be like a semi-skilled occupation that's going up right now. But I mean, we're not doing it. We're following the previous literature. There's always issues for how one categorizes this. But I don't know if there's anything more interesting to say about how we do this. We just do whatever we've done before. Brian, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, semi-skilled is going to be craftsmen and operatives. So you can think of operatives as anyone operating a machine. Craftsmen is like machinists or any sort of skilled trade. So you can think of like skilled blue collar. And then skilled is just going to be any like clerical, sales, managerial positions.
But that's what other people do, right? We follow. Yeah. But it's a good question. I should explain that more. Yes, sir.
Just to clarify, the way that you categorize them would stay the same when you consider 50s, 60s, and 70s?
Yes, it's the same. So I don't think that the way that the census asks the questions or categorize the occupations changes, but I'm going to check on that. I don't think it did. But
It's pretty similar to 1970 when there's a change in education.
there are small, yeah, that's right. So what Ryan is saying is that at some point in the 1980s, this categorization changes a lot. But for most of the time period that we have, it did not. But we'll take a look at that. Other questions? Okay. Okay. So just to show you the results in here, so this is not just 40 to 50, and this is just black man, white man. This is without any controls, with controls, controlling for the draft rates, just as before. And this is just showing that in places with more spending, there was no statistical significant change in the employment rate of black men. These coefficients are, they look negative, but they are super, super tiny. They're like 0, okay? And if we're white men, these look negative, but again, these are super, super small, and they're not statistically significant once we add in control. So another way of saying this is that the war did not change employment rates of anyone relative to the pre-period. And then this is what happens when you look at the share who are semi-skilled, and you see a very big statistical significant increase for black men, and that coefficient actually goes up when we add controls, and we see very small and statistically insignificant and essentially 0 effect for white men. But there is a negative, and I'm going to come back to this negative over here, okay? So then, if you look at wages, it's kind of very similar to the pictures I showed you. We see statistically significant increases in wages of black men, and statistically significant, although smaller, increases for white men. This number is bigger for blacks than for whites in both absolute numbers, so 33 versus 14, and in relative terms. So the wages of black men were substantially lower here, so you can see like that is about 15% or less lower, and so in percentage terms, there's also an improvement for blacks. So either in levels or percentage terms, they just improve in relative terms, yes.
So should we have expected that there would be no change in the type of occupations for whites? Is that?
No, so I'll come back to that. So when we write down the model, what we're going to say is that if there's a decrease in discrimination, what we should see is that actually whites get crowded out. And we're going to test that. And we're going to find that this negative coefficient over here is in fact statistically significant in places with a large share of black men. So basically what's happening is that the black population is a small share of the population, and it's a small share of the employed population. And so this effect of having more black people working in certain occupations is going to crowd out, or like essentially they're going to take the jobs of white people only in places where there are a lot of black people to begin with. And so that's what the model is going to say, and that's what I'm going to find in the data. But the reason we don't find it here is that there are many places where the share of black people and the number of black people is just very small relative to the total. So you get kind of like a negative. So the model says that you should expect some changes for whites, and we do see it in some places. Yes?
Maybe talk about this more later. How do we separate a story where this is changes in discrimination from something like it was big, this big demand shock, and people were able to get training during this period, and then they became more valuable employees because they had the training?
We'll come back to that. Let me look. Good. Good. I have these explanations, or I think I have these explanations. So we see more white men, got more employed in more industries. They don't seem to be getting occupational upgrading. They don't seem to be as much. So that's a little bit against it. But to answer your question, we can do 2 exercises. One we haven't done, but the other one is the one I'm going to show you, which is the people who were affected by the war in like 1942, 43, 44, 45, they're going to be dead by 1970. So it's not going to be possible to explain the persistence of this effect by just saying that these particular workers were more skilled themselves. But there's something else that we can do, which is that we can look at these effects by age and then look to see whether they hold for very young people who would not have been directly impacted by the war. So we're going to do that. Okay. So the magnitudes are relatively large here. The share of semi-skilled, of blacks in semi-skilled plus jobs increases from 0.3 to 0.48, and for whites it also increases a little bit, much less so, 5 percentage points. If we evaluate this at the mean on the war spending, then we can explain about 1/3 of the rise in this increase for blacks, and essentially none of the increase for whites. So again, just to say, we're not saying that these other things didn't affect things. So yes, the deaths associated with World War II, for instance, probably also played a role, but we can explain about a third of what happened. That's in our coefficients. And for wages, we can explain about 13% of the increase for whites and 5% for whites. So that's kind of how to interpret those coefficients. Maybe we can do these a little bit different and think about like the standard deviation of work expenditure or something like that. So we'll think about that. So some questions that have come up already is kind of like what was happening in the period before. And people haven't asked me about this, but I'll go ahead and kill myself by telling you the things you could worry about. And so this kind of shows you what happens to the coefficients for black man and white man. And in here, this is just, we don't have any controls. We have region trends. We have percentage employed in manufacturing and other things like that. We have the predicted draft rate. We have everything else that we can possibly control for, or we control for the baseline income. And nothing happens to these coefficients, and for whites, they remain zeros. There's an issue about what we do with weights, so this is a little sensitive to that, and that's because the number of black people in the 1950 census is small, and that's why we're digitizing the 1950 100% census, so that we can probably get around that. We can control for the baseline population. We can separate these things by age, and we can see a lot of this is concentrated on the younger people. We can exclude the South. Nobody has said, like, the South is so different. We can exclude the South. Somebody else could have said, like, isn't this just black people moving north to where the factories are, and that's all that's going on? No. So we can exclude the potential migrants, and so Ryan had like an awesome way to do this. And in 1950, if you see somebody in the north and they have children, you know where their children were born, so you can kind of figure out if they moved. Anyway, so you can do things like control for the people who were born out of state or do other things like that, and that doesn't affect anything. And these are kind of the post-period, and then these are the pre-period, so you don't see anything in the pre-period. This is what happens to women. Not statistically significant for black women or white women at all. So for the share semi-skilled, we essentially find a zero for whites, and we find a positive effect for black men in the post-period and not in the two pre-periods. So going back to your point before about, like, is this some pre-existing trend? But this is what happened, like 20 to 30, and we don't really see anything there. So we have the same thing for wages, and it's kind of a very similar picture there for wages, although now the results for whites are, positive, but they're also pretty robust. So that's kind of the basic story kind of holds up. And interestingly here, and we haven't done much about this, but for black women, we actually see negative rather than positive effects. And for white women, we see positive and kind of small effects, and this is because by 1950, a lot of them have exited the labor force, and there's a baby boom going on, and maybe that's what's going on here. Oh, sorry.
Did you try to check what happened to the share of professionals who are white men? Is it like a job ladder that white men who had semi-skilled jobs move up to professional jobs, and black men take their place?
Well, the way we define this share, this is a good question, is semi-skilled plus.
Yeah.
So if there was any upgrading at any level above.
But if all white men were semi-skilled plus before, then now they just.
Yeah, we can check, I don't know. So I don't know the answer to that. So what I know is that there's very little, for black workers, there's very little movement. There's almost nobody in the plus category, and there's very little movement there. So most of the action for black men is really in that middle category. We can track and see what happens if there's anything for the white man in that, but that's a good question, I don't know. Yes, there you go.
So were you surprised not to find anything for employment? Because it's kind of contrary to the old Keynesian story of fiscal stimulus.
Well, that's why I preempted that question, I thought, by telling you that other people have looked at the effect of the war and have found no long-term effects on the growth of these areas. And so, if you just look at, people have estimated, the multipliers, have estimated all the stuff, you would think, massive expenditures associated with the war, and wouldn't these areas be doing better into all places? And we don't find anything, but other people who've looked at this also don't find anything. So so let me restate. You'll find that people move in and wages go up, but the per capita stays the same. And so at the end of the day, these places end up with more people, but they're not on average richer places or places that are growing faster than other places. That does present the puzzle to some economic theories, and it also is somewhat sad for people who think that the government can just take a huge chunk of money, 40% of GDP, and make some area grow. Well, no. Okay, that's not what we're seeing, and we're not the first ones to find this. Now you can say this was very special expenditure, and so maybe there's other ways of spending the money that would have had that effect, but there are other papers like look at, for instance, the Tennessee Valley Authority and what that did in the long run and stuff. And so there's a big debate about like place-based policies and whether sending money to places matter. And I suspect that the answer is that it might matter, but it probably depends on how you spend the money and other things like that. But the World War II experience just seems to say that. I think it is surprising. I don't know what else to say about that. Okay, so anyway, I want to spend a little bit more time afterwards on what happened later on. But so now let's just look at the persistence of these effects. So let's just redo these estimations. And let's just look at what these coefficients look like. We estimate them 40 to 50, then 40 to 60, then 40 to 70. And what you can see is that when you do this for blacks, I mean, the last one in 1970 has big standard errors, but it's kind of like a persistent effect. And so that kind of was going to be my answer to that. Although I acknowledge large standard errors here, but you can kind of see the level. Somehow it seems to be that wherever black workers were able to enter during the war, they were kind of able to stay in there for quite a bit. Yes?
Why stop in 1970?
Why stop? It's the occupational classification that changes. But I guess we could try to do something, but then people are going to say, but we could. I mean, there is a hint in here that this is starting to fade out, and so it would be interesting to push it kind of further. You know, if you look at any economic data in the United States, you will see 3 distinct periods. You know, before 1940 with high inequality and high wages, and you know, the 40s to 80s with like high wages and low inequality, and then the 80s later. And there's something happens after 1980 that changes the labor market and the distribution of income quite substantially. So it's possible that, you know, whatever this was, it somehow erodes away eventually. And it would be interesting to look at that, so maybe we should.
It seems to coincide, I guess, with this sort of stagnation of education and the decline.
Yes, it's interesting. Yes. Yes, sir?
Oh, I'm really confused about it. So your finding is that the many of money during the war goes to the industry related to the war.
Yes.
Right. And then those kind of the industries actually hired many of the semi-skilled black people.
Yes.
So then after the World War,
Yes.
the war industry necessarily decreased. So for example, after the World War II, United States did not need any factories to make a tank or other missile things.
Mm-hmm.
Then
Okay.
how do you explain that?
So that's a very good question. So, you know, what happened though during a lot of the war is that a lot of factories were, in some sense, retrofitted or fitted to produce war stuff, and then they reverted back to doing whatever they did before.
And
So, as I said, the majority of the spending, I mean, there was some spending, like, okay, there was some spending to, like, do the atomic bomb, and then after that, and they dropped the bomb, they, you know, that effort diminished quite substantially, and a lot of the people working in those areas just went back to work at other things. But in manufacturing, what's really happening is that you have factories that produce cars, and then they produced bombers, which also use metal in their machine, and then they went back to producing cars. And so there were the same factories employing the same people, and they changed what they produced, but they didn't like disappear in the way that the effort to produce the bomb was. So think retrofitting, changing what you produce more is most of what's going on rather than producing the bomb, which is what you have in mind. And so I think that's the explanation here, which is you have regular firms that now have an experience with employing these populations during the war, and they appear to continue to do that after the war ended, even though they're no longer producing, bombs or aircraft or something like that. A lot of these places are also like, they're producing uniforms, they're canning food, they're doing things that support the war efforts, but are not necessarily like artillery or something like that. So we can probably show you a breakdown of what exactly the expenditures went for, and that might give you an idea. But really, the existing industrial infrastructure was retrofitted, and that's what explains, I think. Yes, somebody?
Oh, I was just going to say, but the big economic boom because of delayed demand during the war being expressed during the early 1950s after the war also presumably helped factories remain open and retrofit and
Yes.
so forth.
And that goes away. So
Right,
we all agree
it
that
does.
this is a temporary expenditure, and after the war ends, the expenditures get taken away.
Well, except, I guess what I'm saying is the economic boom in general during the 1950s would prolong or would provide incentives to industry to continue manufacturing.
So there's two things that are true. The areas that got more money didn't grow more, but the 1950s are a period of great growth. And that's
Right.
what she's saying, that after the war, there is demand for the products, and so these people, these factories are able to sell their products. And so, that's an interesting point, because it does suggest, it could have been another way. It could have been that we go back to the 1930s after the war to some kind of dismal economic environment, and maybe the effect of this policy would have been different with different economic background after the war, and I actually don't know that. Yes, sir?
I'm curious how you account for death from these regions. So the military is organized very differently for World War II in that the divisions are all done regionally, because the National Guard is like the primary way that units are organized. So for instance, if you lose half a whatever division, you're actually losing half of New York City, right? Or presumably, right, at some battle. So I'm curious whether you accounted for the percent deaths, I guess.
So we don't have data on the deaths, but again, so in all of our regressions, we're controlling for either the predicted draft or the actual draft. So the people who died had to be drafted. And what I've shown is that the draft cannot really explain away our results. So this is not to say that the deaths during World War II didn't matter or didn't generate effects themselves. They did, but the areas where there was a lot of people drafted were areas where there was very little money. I showed you that negative correlation. So the effects that we're finding are not because lots of people died in these factories and then blacks were hired. The effects we're finding are because lots of people were hired and blacks were hired and they remained hired afterwards. Which is not to say that what you have in mind didn't happen. There is a paper showing that it did happen. It's just kind of negatively correlated with what we are observing. In the places with a lot of manufacturing, very few people were drafted and even fewer died. And so that is a relatively small effect in here. Overall, over the nation, that might be a contributing effect. So we only explain 30% of the upgrading, and so there's another 60% that can be explained by these other factors, such as the fact that in some areas, particularly the South, say, lots of men died, lots of skilled men died, and so that's another thing that's happening, that has also happened. So I'm not claiming it's all the money, I'm just saying a piece of it is, and the piece that we've identified that it's the money is not really, cannot be really explained away using the drafts. But this said, we don't have the deaths by occupation and whatever. Somebody has digitized that and we don't have access to that ourselves. So we could try to check, but we don't have the data.
Yeah, because I guess I was curious, when you first started to talk, you talked about black boys without fathers. And so that brought into question, if you're measuring it post the war, are they fathers that are just not present, or fathers that are lost in the war effort, which then may affect family income and use wages?
That is a very interesting point. And let me try to finish this so in my last 15 minutes I can talk about the schooling stuff and we can go back to that, because I think those results are worth discussing and I think is an interesting points. Let me come back to that. Yes, sir, you have a question?
I was wondering if you had any way of discerning whether the anti-discrimination idea is diffused actually beyond the firms or cities where they reflect the person's employment.
Let me go back to that. And the answer is that they appear to. That's part of, so when we break things down by different industries and whatever it is, we appear to see this happening. So, but let me get back to this for a second. So what I wanted to show you here is that this appears to persist, although it starts to waver down. If you look at wages, it goes up and then somehow it starts to go down. This is just to show that the predicted draft rate doesn't do anything for blacks. Interestingly enough, it does do something for whites. Okay, so again, the war and the death and the draft did actually affect economic conditions for people other than blacks, but it does not explain away the results we've shown you here. Okay, so there's no relationship between the share of semi-skill and the predicted draft rate for the black population. That's something to show here.
Have you done this for women as well? Because there's that prior literature on mobilization and.
Yes, we've gone back a lot and back and forth on this. So there are 2 papers that look at this, and we can somewhat. So I showed you the coefficient for women here. Okay, and so if we look at what this is women, and this is for semi-skilled, and this is for wages.
Yeah.
So we can, I would say, we can somewhat replicate the previous literature. What we find when we try to replicate the previous literature is that the results for women are not that robust. But anyway, so we've discussed this a lot, and I don't know why exactly that is. There is an issue of the measurement of the draft. So most people we have like 140 cities, or we are looking at commuting zones. That literature looks at states, and it has 50 states. Our results hold at the state level, but the effects of the draft themselves are very sensitive to whether we do it at the city level or at the state level. And part of the reason is that the data at the local level are somewhat less reliable. So we have a little bit of trouble with that. So that's another kind of concern to keep in mind. Okay, anyway, I have 10 minutes. I have to finish this. Okay. Okay, I'm going to skip the model. But all that I want to say with the model is that you were just asking me about, is there any evidence that this is some kind of spillover or something? And if you look at it, it's not entirely clear, but so the defense industry, in the defense industry, you see the biggest increases in the relative share of blacks. You see it mostly under age 35, and you see it mostly under 9 years of schooling. You don't see so much here for non-defense. So I should take my answer back, right? Now that I just look at this, I'm like, you don't see it so much in the non-defense industry. So I'll have to look at that. So I guess maybe I was thinking about, where's the other table? Oh, we took out the other table. Okay, no, this table. Okay. So somebody asked me, isn't it surprising that you don't see anything for whites? And here's what I'm kind of showing you, is that if you interact the effect of the war expenditure with the share of the population that was black in 1940, then what you'd find is that there is a displacement effect. So that in places where blacks advance, fewer white people have those jobs. And so you do tend to see this kind of effect. So we've done this a little bit. These results are somewhat sensitive to how exactly we measure this share. We also see that for blacks in the sense of there's a competition effect. In places where there were already more blacks entering lower the wages of the whole group, of the group as a whole. And so you kind of do see a little bit of also crowding out in these places, but you see much more so for whites than for blacks. Okay, sorry. So with these other, we have other things to kind of check and see, is this because of changes in the distribution of occupation? Is this because of the changes in migration? Is this because of the changes in industry? And the answer to all of these questions appears to be no. It's mostly within industry, within occupation, within skills. In a particular sector, we see these upgrading. So that's kind of what we seem to see. And so that seems to be consistent with this idea. So here, why would discrimination decline, right? So like the idea that we're left with is that maybe this is discrimination. So there is the executive order and some evidence that this was enforced. There are labor shortages, and so the idea is that the labor shortage would push employers to use people that they weren't used before. There was also something else, and we're trying to get data on this to make this more precise, but a lot of the firms that received money from the government also were forced to get training from the government. And there are 3 types of training that they did. One was like stock management and things like that, but a really important one that they did was human resource training. And so training on how people are to be monitored, managed, and compensated. And things like if you should have checklists, and if people have done all these things, then you need to promote them and stuff like that. So we think that that might have also had something to do with the advancement of Blacks in these industries. So we're trying to work more on this, but the idea that we have is basically these places didn't want to hire Black individuals or migrants for that matter. They were forced to hire them because of labor shortages that resulted from the war. And after the war, they continue to hire them either because the employers changed their beliefs about how good these worker were, or the other employees changed their willingness to work with Black workers that they previously hadn't explained to that. Now, of course, we would like data on this, and we would love to have like some kind of survey data on perceptions and discrimination or something else like that, and we've been trying to unearth that from various places, but it's not clear that there's anything really helpful for this time period. So we're working on that. Okay, but in the last 5 minutes, let me try to show you the other exciting part of this paper is looking to see what happened to the kids. So we're going to look at whether the war expenditures had any impact on the schooling of the next generation. And as I mentioned before, it could be there's an increase in parental income. So we've already shown there's an increase in absolute and relative terms of the Black population. It could be some change in the returns to schooling. As I mentioned before, the returns to schooling declined substantially during this period. So just to give you some background, the returns to a year of schooling were about 8% in 1915 to 1920, and they're like now at like 4 to 3% in the post-war period, and then they start rising, and now they're back like at 8 or 9 or 10%. So there's like a big U-shape. So during this period, the returns to schooling are great. When we look to see whether the returns to schooling were somewhat greater in areas that got more money, we find that they were. So the returns to school are falling, and they're not changing or not greater in places that got more money. So we can kind of rule that out. There is maybe changes in the area's income. We already showed you that these areas did not grow and did not necessarily do better than other areas. But it could be that at the local level, like in the neighborhood, African Americans who benefited from this, the war, have more money, maybe they spend more money or more other political power in the provision of public goods, including schooling, so maybe that's something that's going on. And maybe people use their money to live in places that are less segregated or where schooling is better. So let me quickly show you the impact of the war expenditures on the 16 to 18-year-olds. And so just to go back, this is the people we focus on, because before, at age 15, almost everybody is in school, particularly in the places that we're looking at in urban areas. And so this is the place where a lot of people drop off. And we don't look at college because we want to really, it could be that we want to avoid the complication of the GI Bill and the college going thing. Although we're trying to get data on that, so we could also eventually look at this. And so the difficulty in here is going to be like, who should we expect to be affected? like at what time, but we're gonna run essentially the same regressions as before. And so let me just jump into it and show you what we find. So here's black kids, boys, and girls, and same thing for whites. And this is our standard specification, and we see that about 50% of kids are enrolled in school, and in places with greater war spending, that's about 5 percentage points greater, and is statistically significant. We don't see anything for girls. These results hold if we exclude the South. And for white children, what we see, and this is quite puzzling to us, and we don't really know, we don't see any effect in boys. That's kind of consistent with the fact that for whites we don't see much, although there's a little bit of an increase in income, but there's a decrease in the enrollment of white girls. Yes, ma'am?
Well, we can talk about this later. I want you to finish.
Okay, so so the income of white men I showed you did kind of go up. White women did go to work during the war, but then they went back home. I don't know whether this has something to do with baby boom that happened after the war, or whether it has to do with some kind of, anyway, I'm be very curious if people have something to say about that. I don't have exactly a good explanation for the results for white girls. They are very surprising. And it's also somewhat surprising that the effects are concentrated among boys and not girls in this population. So I'll have some story to say about that. But before I continue, let me show you this. We further split this by whether the father was present or the father was not present. And the reason to do this is that I show you that all of our results are about black men getting into better jobs and getting greater wages, and we don't find any effects for black women, right? So there's two possibilities there. A subset of the black population got richer, and now everybody's doing better off as a result. Another one is that this particular family got richer because this particular individual is now earning greater wages. So by separating these two out, we can kind of test for this. And what we can see is that all of the effects that we find are just for boys whose father is at home. And if the father is not at home, then there's an effect. It's positive, but it's less than half of this, and it's not statistically significant. And for girls, we continue to not find anything. And again, for white girls, we continue to find like a negative effect. One thing that's interesting is these effects are negative, but they're kind of small. So maybe not too much to worry about. But I mean, they're still kind of surprising. So I don't want to brush that aside. I just don't have an excellent explanation for it. So this is what's happening to enrollment. And then we can look and see what happens to high school completion, excluding the South and excluding immigrants. And then we can look at that over time. So this is the coefficient on war expenditures. And so this data now, instead of doing it 40 to 50, this data is using is this the biennials that we're using now?
It's 1960s.
Oh, it's 1960s. Oh, it's by quarter. Okay, I'm forgetting that now. Okay, because we've done another exercise. Sorry, I just meant to say we did another exercise that is not this one, but we do have data on what happened during the war to schooling. And what I wanted to say is that during the war years, kids did not go to school. So there's actually a dip in the schooling during the war years. So these effects that we're finding are like 40 to 50. So they are accounted for by what happened after the war. Because during the war itself, there is a decrease in enrollment for everyone. But somehow it catches up afterwards. And so in here now, we exclude the South and we exclude immigrants just to make sure that that's not what's driving our results. And we're showing you the coefficient for different cohorts, and you can kind of see an improvement for black kids, not for white kids. And it holds up if we do this exclusion. Okay. I'm going to take 1 minute, and I was late, so I shouldn't take any more of your time. Okay. We find in here that the expenditures explain about a third of the increases of high school completion during this period. And we end up concluding, given these results, that parental income is the main mechanism. I have some regressions on other mechanisms. So here, we collected some data on school expenditures per capita in the city, and here are indices of racial segregation. And when we look to see whether the war affected whether a particular city spends more on schooling or whether a particular city is more segregated, we find nothing. So we don't find any changes city-wise. These cities did not grow more, they didn't spend more on schooling, they were not less segregated. So overall, it points to the idea that it's the kids whose fathers got more money and who are now in better occupations who did this. And because we only find it for boys, I'm going to suggest that there's both an income and either a like a role model effect going on, like so these are occupations that mostly men go into, and so maybe it's the boys, or maybe there's some form of for both blacks and whites, some gender discrimination going on where the family is choosing to treat boys and girls differently, and I cannot distinguish between those explanations, but it doesn't seem like there's anything really changing about the infrastructure of these cities and the societies. It's just more about the family. So anyway, I'm out of time, so I'm going to stop. Thank you.